Welcome to the journey of an aesthete, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human. Nancy Loeb.
Yes.
This is Mitch Hampton from Journey of an Aesthete podcast. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. My very first podcast.
I was gonna mention that in the introduction. Usually when I have guests, I do I kind of try to make a brief introduction where I where I praise the guests and explain why they're on the show. And so I'm going to do that now. So this among other things, this is the first time this guest, Nancy Loeb, has been on any podcast, as you just said, correct?
Correct.
So that's a first. But the major reason why you're on our show is because of a subject that's probably, in some respects, unusual. Because on our show we have writers and filmmakers and painters. We did have a practicing therapist on another show, Thomas Moore, who's a best-selling author, but that was more about his just general being a writer and his own interest in Carl Jung. But this is the very first time we're having a show dedicated to the art of therapy and healing. And I must say this is a very important part of life because, as you know, our guest Nancy Loeb is a pioneer in this field, going back many decades, and she works with some of the most difficult of situations, children in abuse and eating issues and just general mental health. She was a forerunner in Atlanta in issues of legal aid, and generally somebody who is there when people are having a really rough time and trying to improve their life and trying to heal. And so you are gifted, and you are again a pioneer, a leader in this field. And so I thought it'd be really great to have you come on our episode, the show, and usually what we do is we do what I call a linear chronology, which is a fancy way of saying personal biography. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to hear about how you came to work with people in this manner and helping them in a very, again, I would say probably the most sensitive and profound aspects of human life in the interpersonal communication inside what happens in the therapy room. And I'd love to hear you talk about how you came to practice that and also how you have helped people. So welcome to our show. I hope that wasn't too long-winded. I tried to doing this off the cuff.
That was very special. Thank you. I think it all started back in fourth grade when one of my classmates told me I should be a therapist, that I was easy to talk to, and that I should consider that for a career. So I think that may have been one of my first awakenings. Went to elementary, high school in Nashville. College, I finished at George Peabody College for Teachers at Vanderbilt University, and I taught Spanish for a few years, always knowing, and even then, going back to school to get my master's in psychological services and community counseling. And from then on, so for about the last 33 years, I have had the privilege and maybe challenge to come up against and with some of the most unbelievable people. And I just feel so grateful to have had this career and to have watched them as they grow. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of how it all started. Was we moved to Atlanta back in 1970, and I started teaching on Bankhead Highway, which was one of the roughest streets in Atlanta.
Right.
And wow, I got a lot of information and street smarts there. My husband was with Atlanta Legal Aid, so that's where the interest in certainly so many rights of people, whether it was civil rights, rights of women, rights of children, came about. And we saw so much change then with the laws. We often said that, you know, the courts were good, the laws were not, and things were changing right in front of us. So my years of teaching and then becoming a therapist and certainly working cases from child abuse to murder cases to assault cases to I moved to Atlanta and I'm having a hard time adjusting. So I often tell therapists if they're in training, you better know a lot about a lot of different things because one thing links to another.
Well, that's a beautiful starting point. I mean, I guess the thing that impresses me, if you don't mind me going back, because this is kind of awe-inspiring to someone like myself, because you're talking about this as a little girl in school in the fourth grade, somebody saying you're good at talking to people in a very casual manner, and then all of a sudden you're teaching Spanish, and I guess you're getting a bachelor's of arts, but then you're actually becoming a psychotherapist. I just want to go back to more details about the shifts of all those. That's a lot, because that seems to me a lot of a change, in terms of your life, and certainly. Legal aid is one of the most important developments of the 1970s itself. And of course, you were part of that. So what was the first beginning where you sort of, how does a young budding therapist, how did they go about navigating that and doing that? I'm just interested in that.
Well, for me, it was so interesting because when I started teaching at 21 and like 2 years later, into my classroom walks a junior at the school, and her eyes were black and blue, and she was somewhat bloodied. There were some welts on her face. And back then, if you thought there was abuse, you went to the nurse. So I took her, and we went down to the nurse. And that was really my first child abuse case. As it happened, that was in probably 1973. Wow. And the police came, and they took her out of her home, and put her into foster care, where she just thrived. It was just an incredible thing to watch. And she graduated and went on with her life. But that was my first real case. And to really see how to maneuver that, to work with, certainly kids that had all kinds of, talents and challenges. Mm-hmm. And to go from that, but I'd always wanted to go into psychology and counseling, so I had actually started graduate school some, and then I just went full force ahead, finished my master's, and got a job at what became Emory Adventist. It was Smyrna Hospital. And they had an addiction unit. They had an eating disorder unit. And even back then, so much of addiction went back to trauma, early childhood trauma. And so that really became my area, was working with early childhood trauma and with trauma victims, trauma survivors, some of the perpetrators sometimes. Wow. And that's how it really took off. And then there I worked many survivors of incest and survivors of trauma cases. I worked individually with them, with the family. And then a few years later, I went into private practice, and it's just been that way ever since.
Wow. So I guess I was right to call you a pioneer in that sense, because I think at that time you were at the beginning of learning about this aspect of life inside the family, outside the family, stranger abuse, as well as familial violence. I was
actually. Anna Freud was, even in her time, was one of the first to really start doing some research.
Of course, yeah, I didn't mean that, but I guess from my, I'm just looking at this from a very narrow point of view of being 54 years old and thinking about the past few decades. Of course, there's never, as you know, there's never anybody totally original. Everybody has, especially Anna Freud, as you know, I'm friends with somebody who would study with Anna Freud. So
really,
that's a whole other, so that's a whole other. But I guess the thing that fascinates me is this gift you have. When two people meet, they talk often, right, out on the street. We call that conversation.
Right. There's
something special about what happens in a therapy, almost I would say the sacred space of the therapy room. That's not everyday, ordinary conversation, right? And so you trained a certain way of speaking with another human being. It seems to me to sort of make breakthroughs and to make progress in that person's life. What are your thoughts about how you developed that, or how you is it from the very first clients to that interests me.
I think calm is the key word, along with being open, with them feeling welcome and not in any way going after too much information too quickly, and just letting them have a safe person and a safe place to talk, because often these people have never had a safe person or a safe place to talk. And I often talk about one of my clients way back in the early survivors of incest groups, and we'll just call her Lisa. And Lisa would work all day as a server in a restaurant to pay for the group. And she would come and pay for a group, and she'd come into the group. Now, all the participants in the group are survivors of incest, right? Mm. And she would come into the group and would say, if anyone speaks to me, I'm going to leave. And so all I would say was, I'm glad you found a safe place to come. And then after about 10 minutes, it would be fine. And people would talk anyway. And, but I could see people learning how to trust a little bit, which is more than life had given them. And what I found were these were the best and the brightest of people. They learned how to survive in situations like most of us have never experienced. But not only did they survive, they had senses of humor, and they cared about other people. And, what a joy to work with this population and to see that. Mm-hmm. And through the years, I've trained many teachers and administrators in what to do, how to recognize a child who may be being abused or was abused. And the stranger danger is so much less than the actual family and friend danger. Usually kids are harmed by people they know.
Yeah, that's the reason why I did mention that in my a few minutes ago. I made a point to talk about inside the family and people, unfortunately, people that they're closest to are harming them rather than someone in a dark alley, stereotype of someone in the dark alley or in
right.
But I'm just wondering, you mentioning groups, so I guess that must have been one of the earlier of this type group. Now that's one kind of experience, but then there's individual one-to-one therapy experience. Do you mind talking about some of your very first, I guess your first clients that you could, whatever comes to your mind, your consciousness about somebody that stands out, other people, you're working with them, I guess they're coming in every week, and you're starting to see, I guess you might call it the breakthrough or the awakening or I guess I'm going to use the word progress, real progress, which is possible. It interests me what your journey as a therapist, how you're starting to see these things happen and what's encouraging you and what you're.
one day I had an administrator from one of the hospitals call, and he was coming in, and we'll just call him Mark. Mm-hmm. And Mark got to the parking lot, and he called me and said, "I'm frozen. I can't move." And he was crying. So I said, "Don't worry, I'll come get you." So I go out to the parking lot and get him. And all he could say was he was so relieved to get some help. So, I mean, he didn't know me. I'm out in the parking lot retrieving this guy. And we went in and he talked and he talked. And not only was it the abuse that he had suffered from his parents, but it was also the anger that he had toward others. Mm-hmm. And, and we can just talk about that. I'm not one to get overly dramatic or overly loud. Mm-hmm. And I think that gives them a space to really start to look at things. And I'm a firm believer that they're the boss. They need to let me know what they want to work on. And especially in the beginning, I don't push. I'm glad they're there. And, and they work. I mean, we don't talk about necessarily the weather or the latest basketball game, but it gives them the freedom to explore their mind because they know what they know. They feel what they feel.
Wow.
And
so hold that thought. So there's different ways of knowing. And I guess what you're saying is that you start with the right approach. You say, well, I want to do just so much in the beginning so that certain things can happen later. And I guess you learned how to do that. That's really interesting to me that because that is an art. Not everybody has that. So you say the client is the boss. And that's what I say on my podcast. A lot of times I'll say, the guest, I want the guest's your point of view and your perspective, not mine or not right. So.
Right. And then we start the journey. Often what we know is what is the presenting issue, what they've come in for is not the main issue.
Interesting. Huh.
And so we all pretty much know that, the presenting problem may not be the main problem, but at least it got them there. They made a call, they made an appointment, they came in, now we do virtual or they come in. Yeah. And so, our world has certainly changed. But, again, there seems to be such a relief of just finding a place and a person that they can talk. And we'll explore, and I'm the first one to say, let's figure out what works. If something doesn't work, we'll throw it out. And we'll figure out roads and journeys and trips that will work. And tools. I'm big on toolboxes. What's in your toolbox to help you get through this job or relationship or family situation? Of course, I'm extremely big on protecting children.
Absolutely. Do you talk about a couple of situations that come to mind where you really, made a difference in a child's life? I'm sure there are many examples where we, really, as I say, the most difficult people at their hardest hit, and you're able to make a difference. That's
it just takes your breath away. I had one little gal, she was 8, and she had been kidnapped to another country by her family from part of her other family. And she learned that it made the other family very nervous if she wouldn't eat, and she kept losing weight. And finally they were scared she wasn't going to live, so they sent her back here, which was great. And she was in the hospital though with horrible stomach issues, and so I was called in to consult at the children's hospital. And my theory was I'm not a doctor, and So the medical end of it was up to them, but I thought it was mainly post-traumatic stress. Mm-hmm. And we started working on that, and we did all sorts of things. And boy, she just thrived in that. And even this 8-year-old said, "Oh, Nancy, I wished I had met you sooner." Mm-hmm. And we worked, and she was like a little miracle. She really was. And, again, she grew, and it wasn't the medical issues, which a lot of the times it is. Mm-hmm. Another child had been left alone all night, and when she was 4, and she picked up the phone and dialed 911.
Oh, wow.
And called the police, and the police came, and she always said how they gave her blue bubble gum that night. Mm. And all I know was she did not want to stay with her mom. She certainly did not want to stay there. Mm. And so we were able to, get the custody sent over to the father, and she just grew and grew. And some of these I've been able to see through the years. I had another guy, and we'll just call him Tom. And Tom was an athlete and a basketball star. He was being molested by his father, and he would have dreams of monsters. And he was the top scorer basketball player on his team, except when his father was at the game. And every game he would score 0 if his father was there. Otherwise, he was the top scorer. So these stories, as you see them coming into themselves and being safe, and, if they have to be taken out of a home, then they're taken out. Wow. Hopefully we can get things straightened out enough for children to grow. I had another case where the child had 128 open wounds on her body. And it was a nightmare. And she was certainly put into foster care. Wow. And, you just saw this, and you saw this child just wanting to go home, and it just broke your heart. And all I could say was, we can't let you go home till it's safe.
Right.
And so, those are the children.
Well, that last case you just mentioned, what do you mind saying what eventually
what eventually happened was she was reunified with the family. I did not think the family was ready for that. Mm. So I wouldn't sign the papers, but they did put her back in with the family and with tools of who to call and what to do. Yeah. And so it's the judgment of many that comes into that.
I'm just really wondering also too, and I want to get into some definitions because again, I'm a lay person. I've read a lot of psychology, but I'm certainly no expert. As you are, I just wanted you talk about you were discovering, I guess, definitions of post-traumatic stress. Do you mind defining that and similar things for the audience or listener? In terms of what the...
Sure. Post-traumatic stress is some kind of trauma that crosses major lines. And the trauma is something in your past that keeps invading your world of today. Mm-hmm. And we talk about PTSD being a normal set of reactions to an abnormal event. Mm-hmm. And so, post-trauma comes usually a month or more after the actual, first there's acute trauma, which is immediate. And then post-trauma comes a month to sometimes 3 months or more after the actual trauma. Mm. Now, with children or adults, the trauma is not just one trauma. It's not like the hurricane came through and was gone. Mm. It can be ongoing. Resilience can be knocked down. Mm-hmm. And there's flashbacks and nightmares. And the flashbacks and nightmares leave the victim feeling like it's happening all over again. Mm-hmm. So those are things we look at with PTSD. Originally, PTSD we thought about it with the Vietnam vets or the other vets. They came back, and originally shell shock was one of those words of describing it.
I remember that George Carlin, late George Carlin routine, where he talked about how shell shock was he liked that phrase. He thought it was captured something about, and I guess that was World War One, right? Going back to World War One, World War Two.
Right. The picture and everything. And then, though, we noticed that these same traits are also going in children that were abused or adults, domestic violence survivors, things like that. You'll see the same symptoms with them. So then the PTSD widened and became more of a diagnosis, and certainly we see it now. And, what we know is, people as they work on it and develop tools and maybe some medication, depending on the situation,
right,
they get better.
It strikes me that what you're doing is maybe more important than physical medicine or medical, the body. Because it seems to me so much more sensitive, and it seems to me, is that a fair? I mean, I'm thinking out loud again because I'm no expert, but it seems to me that your job might be in some respects more important.
Well, it's probably a combination, because what we know is that trauma not only affects you psychologically, it'll affect you physically. Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the top traumatologists in the world, will talk about how the body remembers.
Yes.
And it does. And then there's a lot of research on the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve goes from your brain straight down to your stomach, through your heart, through your chest. And so when people get anxious or scared, often will say, where does it go? And some people will say, oh my gosh, my heart beats, or my back is sweaty, or my neck is sweaty, or my stomach is having a hard time. And so there's a lot of studies going on about the vagus nerve. And so the medical team, is learning more and more too about how trauma affects your body.
Well,
and they talk about. Go ahead.
Hold that thought. I'm aware that, of course, it's all united and all works together. But I was basically thinking that, sometimes there are wounds that are invisible and maybe not neglected by society, right? And you come in and you say, hey, wait a minute here. We gotta look at this. And I'm sure you've. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but.
No. A lot of my trauma survivors will say they feel invisible. Someone will say no matter how loud they screamed, nobody heard them. And I think you'll see that now if you watch the news of the Olympic gymnasts.
Yes.
And the court hearings and the Senate hearings and the House hearings, all that's going on, how they and their families let people know about the abuse and nobody did anything. And so, and if they don't get attention, then you think, other people are going to. No, they're not.
Yeah.
And so we kind of look at that and say, okay, how can people hear? Some people say childhood trauma is the single most preventative issue in America.
Wow.
That, what would it take to at least lessen the numbers?
Yeah.
And then, we go to the core of trauma, our children or adults who feel disconnected and invisible. So your word invisible was spot on.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking very simply about how our society is often superficial in a pejorative sense of the word superficial. We see somebody whose leg is in a cast or somebody's hooked up to an IV in an ICU unit, and that's very obvious pain, right? That's very obvious suffering. But then there's other kinds of suffering just as bad, mental, spiritual, And the kinds of things you're talking about are caused by other people, the people that are supposed to love you. You know, your parent or a coworker. That seems to me the most tragic, and so that's why I thought that may be more invisible or not to society. Mm-hmm. Except, of course, at these hearings, which I think is very good. And do you follow those hearings? Are you involved? I'm sure you the Olympic.
Well, I've been following them because it's unbelievable that we're talking well over 100 gymnasts were molested, and it was reported. Mm. And really nothing was done. And as upset as people can be today, you go back to, where was the blockage? Mm-hmm. They're mandated reporters, whether it's the FBI or the medical community or whomever, the therapist. And where was the block? Where did it come to a roadblock? And so, I think we've got to look at that. I mean, right now we're seeing people on ventilators, and they're just numbers right now. And the statistics are nothing but people without their tears. And we're seeing numbers over and over again, and it doesn't seem to be filtering into people's heads sometimes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'd imagine. I'd imagine over the years that you're dealing with people's, again, the most sensitive aspects of people's lives, the raw material of their life, their story, their experience, their souls, really. But I'd imagine you have to intervene into public or legal aspects, right? Especially, as you said, you refused to sign papers because you said this kid should not be in that house. And so you've had to do the right step up. Is that a different kind of role than the therapist role, or is it all to you mixed up together, or is it sort of, because I imagine that gets involved in sort of the legal issues and family law, and I'm wondering what your reflection or thoughts on that over the years having to navigate that.
Right, and that's pretty intense. I've worked many court cases, and it is intense because usually the court cases are about children or domestic abuse. Mm-hmm. And some therapists say, I won't work a court case. I refuse to. They have people sign the documents, and that's until you get a subpoena. Then you better get trained pretty darn quickly. That's just reality. And so, again, one thing can lead to another. Mm-hmm. And reports have to go in. I get sometimes certainly my charts are subpoenaed as evidence, things like that. Mm-hmm. And of course, confidentiality has to be respected and everything else.
Sure.
So it's a lot of learning. I worked some of the church abuse cases.
Oh, wow. You mean the Catholic Church? Diocese and
the Catholic Church and
others.
Some other churches here where they, really took in some young teenagers and waited until they were 18 and started molesting them. And I think my first one of those cases, and I'm still working with some of the people, was 30-something years ago. Wow. And I mean, the damage that is done is not over with sometimes in a day or a week or a year. Right. It's not like we're working constantly on it. Mm-hmm. But boy, those are some hard cases where not only is it about people abusing people, but they're abusing God too.
Yeah. Well, of course, they're misusing people's faith and people's people's credulity, you might say, for the worst of ends, the most the most antithetical to what the stated or purported meaning of that faith is, or stated public relations of it is. It's very insidious. I just wondering. It sounds like you've done a lot of cases like that now. Is this all in the geographical in the Atlanta area, or is this
I've had some that are out of town, but most of them are right here. Atlanta's a big city.
It is.
And yeah, most of them are, just right here. I worked a murder case. It was a murder shooting case where the security guard shot a number of people. And one day I just got a call from an out-of-town mother that said, please, it had just happened, will you take this case? Because my daughter went to another therapist who didn't know what PTSD was. They didn't know what trauma was. And she had been referred to me.
Oh, excellent.
And from that, there was another one and another one. And so the day of the trial, I was down there as these young people who were purely crossing the street to go to lunch were testifying. The guy had pled guilty and he will, he's in prison with no chance of parole, life with no chance of parole. Yeah. But how it affected these people is, just unbelievable. So sometimes these...
I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say it affects the entire nation because this is a new problem, like going back to the late 90s with Columbine, this problem of public mass shootings, sort of crime sprees where, a group of people or a person just takes a gun and just shoots in the public people. And
right. So in the public, they don't know the people.
And you've dealt with those cases as well. I see, because that's
right.
That's certainly a case of PTSD on a massive scale.
Long term. Yeah, I was saying that in their office that day, it was White Pants Day. So all these young women had on white slacks. And a couple of them said, I'll never wear white slacks again. And it was interesting. And one of them called a number of years later to say, okay, I'm wearing my white slacks again. And so, yeah, and that's the pervasiveness. These cases are pervasive and progressive.
So when that woman contacted you, was that like a victory in her life that she was able to dress the way that she kind of wanted? Is it overcoming of that? Would it be fair to put it that way, or when she? Sure.
It was a victory. Some of my people in my groups or individually have done speeches with me. And I always say in the speeches that, oh my gosh, I think Sir Isaac Newton said, if I can see farther, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And these are the giants in my life. And I will do the first part of the speech and turn it over, teaching people what to look for in abuse cases, whatever. And then I turn it over to my speakers and they take over. And nobody's heard a word I've said. And because this is their life and what they say and how they say it stays in the minds of people forever, for years and years. And the impact that these people have is amazing. So to watch that now, my clients will say, that was one of the most healing things I've done, is to be able to speak to people or tell my story and have people react to it and thank me for sharing that.
Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Well, I was really impressed with some of the material you sent me. You and I believe your late husband from the 70s, some material on the legal aid movement. Did you want to talk a little bit about that movement and that because it seems like such a big thing, I think, in this country, and any reflections you have on that and what it did for people or what it meant, and anything that comes to your mind.
These were young guys right out of law school. They had all gone to really good law schools, and they were They were bright and they were aggressive. They didn't care who they came up against, and they changed the laws. There was actually a couple of books that researched civil rights in the South, and so much of it came right back to Atlanta legal aid. Mm-hmm. And I was just telling somebody the other day that Jay, my husband, worked on giving kidney transplants for people on Medicaid. It wasn't approved by Medicaid. Wow. And he worked on that. And they worked on these civil rights cases and desegregation of schools. And they were so active. And when he left legal aid to go into private practice, he said, I'm always going to take a case whether they can pay or not, if it's a case I want to take that I think is important. So one time it was a pecan pie. Somebody gave him this payment. Another time there's a weather vane on my balcony that was his payment. And that was fine. Mm-hmm. I said, whatever you want to do, that's fine with me. So, their hearts were
very much in the spirit of the 70s for someone to be given a pecan pie for legal. That brings back a lot of memories for me. That's beautiful.
Their hearts were big and they were smart and they just made it happen. And it was just amazing. That was just the world we lived without maybe realizing how much of a difference it would make in the long run.
Yeah.
And he lived and died a legal aid attorney in his own right, and with that mentality, and he had been in private practice and for many, many years, but that was his idea, and he made it happen. I helped, and that was it. And we've stayed friends. I've stayed friends with so many of the people there.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah. And, they're so important in our lives. So we were able to see that happen. And when I told him I'm going back to school again with 3 little kids, and all he said was, that's fine. He'll drive more carpools. That's great.
Wow.
So we made that happen. And so often people will ask me, clients will ask, what makes a relationship work? How does a relationship work? And I said, you let each other grow. He wanted to play tennis one or 2 more nights a week. I said, go. I wanted to go back to school and do this. And, we just made it work.
Wow. Well, there's, I guess, integrity and commitment to this thing the two of you had, as well as the family. It's very beautiful. Yeah. I want to go back to the therapy process again, because I said there's a journey, and of course in the first session somebody might be frightened or not able to trust because violence has been done to them, and they're unfortunately in a family that doesn't understand how to be a family, right? To put it in a more polite, innocuous way. And so this human being, this soul, is in your office. I want to go back to this process because it takes a period of time unfolding. I
had one client who was in her 50s, and she had been abused terribly as a child. And the insurance company said, how long will her therapy need to last? And I said, 11 years. And I said, are you kidding? I said, no, you asked me, so I told you. I don't know. How would I know then? She was just getting started. So Did you ask me a question? I answered it. I think we have to look at, people do come in, especially ones that have never been to therapy before, and they are nervous. And I'll say, I understand you are nervous. I would be too. So, you tell me what you want to start talking about, and then tell me what you don't want to talk about. And we laugh a little bit, and then it starts rolling. I have found over and over again that people are just so relieved to walk in and start working on something that has been heavy on their shoulders for so long. That, there is a relief, and they They set up other, more appointments. One of my clients said she only works with a therapist 4 times and she leaves that therapist. So could she pay me her copay for 10 times? And then she knew she'd come. And I said, whatever works.
So is that sort of a proactive incentive to make sure she goes over 4, that she doesn't stop at 4?
Right. She said she never gets past 4. And I said, okay.
Did it work, or did she go over 4?
It did. Okay. And she was still my client for years and years. Okay. And so it did. But she just knew herself, which was good. She knew herself, and she really wanted that to change. Did you know that the same letters in listen are in silent? Exact same letters. And I think listening is one of the hardest skills we have, especially here in the USA. People are not good listeners. They defend themselves and they want to come back with something, but just to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say in graduate school, we had to take 2 semesters of listening skills because it is so important to help people know that they can be heard. The number one predictor of healing is community. And the community can be a group. It can be another person. It can, be a church or a synagogue, whatever. But to start to develop a sense of community that's safe is one, if not the most healing part of the journey.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly feel that in this very episode, right? That I sort of think that's certainly on topic here.
Oh, yeah. And how do people grow? And I think that's so important, whether it's a child. Sometimes the parents will say, the child won't talk to the parents and the child's not going to talk to me. And I've got to tell you, I've really never had a problem with that. Mm-hmm. Just let them in and I've gotten so many thank you notes, which are just so sweet through the years from families or whatever. And it's just touching and it warms my heart.
Wow. So
I do.
I'd imagine you save some of those, right? Or they're probably.
Oh, I do. I have a whole file of communication. I know, because they're so nice to reread. Because sometimes I think we all need something that's positive and good. Yeah. And I mean, you work very hard in your area, and that takes a talent and an artistry that I don't even know about, but just from hearing you and learning from you.
Well, I'm just the host, I mean, my basic plan, which surprised me that you said the same thing, is you're the boss, I guess, in the same way that your client is the boss. And you said, I was struck when you said that, because that's the same approach I took in creating this podcast. Isn't that interesting? Even down to the same language or the same formulation. Interesting.
And especially with trauma, but with anything, when people are threatened, what we used to say was fight or flight. Mm-hmm. They would either leave or they would fight, one or the other. But what's really there is a lot of people freeze. They can't move. And they're stuck. And they get mad at themselves that they didn't either flee or fight or do something. But you'll see people who just freeze. And some people will go into a trance. Yeah. And I've had that happen in the office.
Wow.
Yeah, even they'll go into a traumatic trance. And they're just gone for, a few seconds or a minute or something like that. And so I think, when we're working with people and see people, then we don't just look for, the fighting. I think only one time in 30-something years when somebody got up and left my group. And then she called and said, "Why didn't you follow me out?" And I said, you left. I was still there.
Yes.
And then she came back.
Oh,
and so that wasn't a problem. Well, but it's interesting.
Well, I'd imagine in a situation like that, you, of course, said to her, well, these other people here, and they wanted, so you're not the only one. So it is a group. So I'm wondering.
Right. And I've worked many, many grief groups because I was a younger widow with, children, two still in school.
Oh.
And the grief groups are just magical in their own right there. And through the years, as I say, many, many, and they want to heal and they want to have a community that maybe other people can understand them. And so, but one day somebody called and asked to be in the grief group, and she said, "Can I please be in the group? The only trouble is my mother died and I hated her, and I know everyone else will be in the group and will be sad for the loss." And she said, "I'm not." And I said, "We would be honored to have you in the group." And it was great. It was another whole dimension.
You mentioned the three things: fight, which is kind of a classical macho thing. You got to fight out of the situation.
Right.
Flight, which is sort of like get me out of here, and freezing. And the third thing seems to me very much connected with, I guess, trauma itself, right? Freezing, that's kind of as traumatic, seems to me a traumatic sort of response. How much of your work with other people is getting them to relate to themselves as a self in a wholly different way, so that they're actually loving themselves and accepting what they did in the most difficult situation, rather than blaming themselves or beating up on themselves? How much of your work is involving that would you say?
Huge, because they have been told often, especially if it's an intensely abusive family, that they're worthless or that they're a fraud or that they'll never be successful. And they really have to start to, one, learn about themselves. Who are they? Are they poetic? Are they musical? Are they, a serious reader? Who they are and how to accept themselves. And let's watch that grow. And often I'll have them write down the negative messages that were given to them and by whom.
Right.
And then can we give them back? Not physically give them back, but they don't belong to you. They're not yours. So whose voice? Because what happens, it becomes their own voice. And they hear this message that says, you're worthless. You have no value. You're going to fail in school. And they start to believe it. If you hear something enough, you're going to believe it. And for them to become first with the ability to listen, and then second to know that that's not their voice. And to have it back, because they're very self-critical. We call it the critical self. And usually the critical self belongs to somebody else.
Right.
And so, how do you give that back?
It's something that was taught to a person. It's not something they came up. I didn't come up with this negative self-image. It was I guess almost in the manner of propaganda. It was instilled in me by another person.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if it's young enough, it's imprinted in their brain. And trauma and negative messages, can change the brain so that they say they really believe it. They're never going to make anything of themselves. They're not a good person or whatever. Yeah. And again, it can be the best and the brightest. And they've pushed their way through school and paid their way. Look, my parents paid my way through undergrad. I didn't come out with any debt. I did that for my kids. And so, how do we encourage? And that's probably a key that I do a lot of too, is the encouragement. These are wonderfully bright and accomplished people that don't think so themselves.
Mm. Well, it's all part of, I guess your system, for lack of a better word, is not just talking, but also things they do at home, writing things down or organizing, I guess, their thoughts in form. Is that's an important part of healing then? And I guess is sort of. I
think an important part of healing is, for them, is what they can take out of our sessions and use in their everyday life. Mm-hmm. And make movement toward healthier for them. How can they move toward healthy? Mm-hmm. And there was some important studies that came out after 9/11 and after the buildings, and the people that were actually in the buildings that did not die actually didn't have quite as much trauma as people thought, as the researchers thought they would. And they said the key element was they had to move. They did not have the immediate trauma because they had to go down the steps, go out of the building, get through the ashes, run across the street, run through the bridge, over the bridge. And they said movement is so key with people's growth. And in my office, people say, well, I feel this way or I think this way. And I say, tell me what you're willing to do.
Oh, interesting.
What are you willing to do about it? That, I acknowledge that feelings and thoughts are all good. You can get stuck there. Right.
So that's
but tell me.
I guess in 9/11, September 11th, where flight was the best of the three, fight, flight, or freeze. That was a flight of going down those stairs. That's interesting. And so that.
Yeah, they had to.
Yeah.
And, I mean, some of them came from, some pretty high stories, and they have talked about, coming down and then getting down and people helping them. Wow. Because there were people there helping, and, just so many people so sadly had died. Mm-hmm. But no, they did. They had to flee, and I think their inner souls told them. But no, I'm very much a behaviorist that, okay, you can have the thoughts, you can have the feelings. What are you willing to do? And that works with addiction. It works with being stuck. It works with frozen. Just tell me one little thing. Mm-hmm. Where can we start today?
Yeah.
And,
some form of action, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very much a realist. Let's see what you're willing to do. And if you don't do it, I'm not a perfectionist. Just send me a text or an email and, tell me I didn't do it. I don't care. I just want you getting better. Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of a phrase I've been hearing a lot in the popular media that was attributed to the economist John Maynard Keynes. He said, what we're able to do, we're able to pay for. Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
So, that, of course, that's considered quite radical, but I guess what he's saying is it's really a question of will and action, right? Because it's like the capacity is first, right? And the rest will follow.
Right.
It's interesting, right? That's
right. But you got to me, that's important movement. Mm-hmm. It's just important movement. And if you're in a room where you're uncomfortable, how do you get up and leave? Mm-hmm. So many people will say it's so hard to, go to this gathering or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so, for them to know that there can be an exit plan as far as getting up and leaving or flying out or whatever, taking a plane if you're in an uncomfortable situation, taking a car, getting an Uber, whatever. Mm-hmm. or lift, and just being able to have some movement. Because when people feel stuck, then they have trouble breathing, or they get more anxious, more depressed, more scared. And children are stuck in these homes where there's abuse. I mean, they don't have the options that adults have.
That's right. Nancy Loeb, is there anything that comes to your mind now that you want to say that you feel needs to be said? Or I know we're in the time of COVID and climate change and all sorts of dramatic events that affect people's lives as much as maybe the things we've been talking about. Is there anything that's on your mind that you want to say, I need this to be mentioned on this episode, or a particular thing?
Well, I think people now are getting quite stressed. They're angry at COVID. It's, just done so much to their lives, but we've still got a population of very young children who aren't allowed to be vaccinated yet. And I think we have some obviously compromised people or other people that can't be. But I think we still have to remember, how do we take care of others along with ourselves? It's not just about us. How can we protect these young children? And I think that's real important. I think relationships are so important. And my definition of relationships is about communication and equality and respect and trust and safety. Those are your just major parts of a relationship. And, to put yourself out there, and you don't have to trust everyone day one or respect them day one. But people, just like you and I talking tonight, it's so wonderful to develop something and to let our worlds get bigger.
Yeah.
And so I'll tell you a quick story. Was when I took my children, most of my children, my 7-year-old grandson to Antarctica, and it was Christmas Day. And I'm Jewish. I'm not Christian. I'm Jewish. But the children, there were a number of children on the trip. It was a National Geographic trip to Antarctica. And some little boy brought a Santa Claus hat. Somebody else had a candy cane. And when the children got onto Antarctica, they built a little snowman. And it was so cute. Just this little snowman. It was Christmas Day. All the kids were participating. It was, I think, 7 or 8 kids. It wasn't a lot. Were participating. But at the end of the day, the National Geographic specialist said to the kids that Antarctica is a sacred place and we must leave it the way we found it.
Oh, wow.
And so they took off the hat and they gave the kid back the candy cane and they smoothed over. And they said, we've got pictures of Santa Claus here, but we have to leave Antarctica the way we found it. And they smoothed it over. Nobody cried. Nobody got upset. But I love teaching. I think when we teach, it can reach out to people. And I, along with others, just love learning. And so there's so much goodness with so much of the world. And to see people grow and the gifts that they give me in my practice.
Well, I do think, if you don't mind me interjecting, I do think that we have to remember the goodness along with the horrors and the evil. Right. Because human life, of course, is both. It's not either or, And I think that's a very all too easy, especially given what does happen to people, what they experience, to forget that the positive thing you just mentioned in the Antarctica, in the sense of
Right, but there is evil, and there's evil within homes, and there's evil within society, and how, what do we need to do to protect people?
Yeah.
And I think people have to. I worked a child abuse case where the child was so battered and nobody turned it in. I mean, I didn't get on it until it had already happened. And the one thing I asked the school as I met with them was, how did you not see this? And they said, this child said she fell off her scooter, whatever. And, no, we have to keep our eyes open, and we have to protect people. And I think you're right. You're absolutely right. We have to see kind of both sides of this.
Well, yeah, in the case of that, you have to be, I guess, a cop and a doctor and you have to deal with, you also have to deal with the school. That's probably its own challenge, right? It's one thing to deal with a household, but a school, the bureaucracy, and I guess you were having to, it's a lot.
Well, and on that tune, I had a professional athlete in one day. He comes in, he's wearing house shoes because his feet won't fit. They're so swollen. He's retired at this point. His feet are swollen. They won't fit into regular shoes. He couldn't fit into a regular seat on an airplane. This happens to some of the professional athletes because they're used to eating so many calories when they're playing. Oh. And when they retire, they can't have that. So he came in and he tells me he saw his cardiologist last week. Wow. And I said, and what did the cardiologist say to you? And he said the cardiologist told him he's got a heart of a 16-year-old. So I said, may I call the cardiologist? He said, absolutely. So I pick up my phone and put it on speaker and called the cardiologist and said, I have this guy in my office. And what did you tell him when you examined him, please? He said, I told him if he didn't lose weight, he'd be dead within 6 months. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And it was so sad. But then we go back to people hearing sometimes what they want to hear.
Yeah. Well, that's a remarkable story. There's a lot there, of course, right? Yeah.
Right. And I think, that's where, like you said, we kind of have to put on, and you do too, put on many different hats.
Yeah.
Is what do we look at, and where do we go with it?
Well, in the case of our public health, I mean, this is something we're experiencing while it's happening. It's not something far in the past. It's not reading about 1918 and the Spanish flu. We're experiencing it now and in the moment.
Right now.
Yeah, and of course, I'm very grateful we have this technology. It's kind of, in a way, is magical that you and I can talk. We don't have to endanger each other. We can talk across great distances and be safe. And so there's that. So, of course, that's...
Right. And it's interesting. Originally, stress, Hans Selye was one of the big names in the 1930s about stress, and he called it the general adaptation syndrome. And when I tell people who tell me they're so stressed, and I'll say, well, let's figure out a way to adapt to these situations. Somehow, if we remove the word stress and put in adapt, it lets them breathe easier.
Of course, that's gas, right?
Yes.
That's
exactly
that's clever.
That's exactly. But, it's things like that. How, what do we need to change? And the world had to change, or else we would have all been in our own homes and not having communication with anyone. And then, we adapted to Zoom, we adapted to FaceTime and to doxing me and all the other ways of still getting to practice for a year from home.
Do you mind talking a little bit about adapting to the virtual? Before we get to that, of course, how you and I met. We had to navigate the technology, and I called you and it didn't work. And you said, well, I'm using the landline. So, of course, you got to use the right number, and we used the cell, and then it worked. But we're all kind of learning about this exotic world of technology. And, of course, you talk a little bit about the Zoom experience. I know people have said many things, but just adapting to that and how that's worked for you, and
it's been really interesting. Originally, we weren't sure how it was, although I have done virtual for many years because some of my people are traveling or whatever.
okay.
And so it wasn't 100% new for me. We had to set up the business Zoom rather than the regular Zoom because we sometimes needed to go over an hour into a 2-hour session for the groups. They were going to go for an hour and a half. So, and a lot of people had a hard time with it. There were some therapists that said, no, I'm just going to see people in masks in the office.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us said, oh, no, at the beginning when it was so contagious and so frightening that we were certainly not going to do and didn't do that. But I have found that people have worked equally as hard on the phone or with Zoom or FaceTime or some of the others, WebEx, all these that we're using. They have worked equally as hard as when they're in my office. I do like, obviously, person to person. I think that I just like that because that's what I'm used to. People were so ready for therapy. Men were reaching out all over the place to get help because it made it easy. They didn't have to take a half day off. And the women said, I don't have to take a half day off from work. And it made it easier. And about 80% of my people want to stay with this technology. And as I say, their progress has been notable. Their ability to name the issues and navigate the issues, I'm a big one on. Let's name it and navigate it. And, let's get moving on this. And so, I think it's just all fit into place. And I give the technology, the IT people, the schools that started and used Zoom or whatever they use and kept the kids at least somewhat engaged, if not totally engaged for the day. I mean, there's just rewards for those people that did that too. But we were able to do it. And it happened any more than you and I figuring out what the problem was tonight.
Yeah, well, everything worked out beautifully, and the connection has been clear, and again, it's kind of magical in a way.
I think it's beyond magical, and there are brilliant minds out there that have figured this out.
Yeah, absolutely. I really do hate saying goodbye, but this podcast can't go on all night. Although I might want it to, because your stories are quite. Well, they're many things. They cover the whole gamut of human life and humanity. Is there anything before we go that you want to say in conclusion, or that you want to want to express, or?
Well, one, my gratitude for you giving me my opportunity to do my very first podcast, and to encourage people to grow in a healthy way, keep growing, even with a pandemic. Keep growing, taking care of themselves in a healthy way. And I know pandemics can tempt many people in many different ways, but I think it's important that we meet people where they are now and grow.
Well, I want to thank our producer for introducing us, because it was Laurie Strickland that made this possible. And I have to say, I want to thank you for especially your time and generosity, because you've had a life busy with so many, job is challenging, so many, there's intensity to it. But I really thank you that you've been able to make the time to be on our show. So
anytime.
And so Nancy Loeb, it's been really beautiful occasion, and so thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. I appreciate your questions and your statements and your intensity. And you keep doing this. You do a beautiful job of it.
Oh, well, thank you. I feel like I'm still a beginner, but we're all kind of in some ways beginners and experts at the same time. So thank you.
There you go. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I don't like goodbyes, so I'll see you soon, folks. Thank you.